Hello, everyone. This is Through My Own Lens by Pedro Garcia. My journey begins back in 1987. I was born in Madera, California, but I would go on to be raised in Fireball, a small, economically disadvantaged community surrounded by thousands and thousands of farmland. Even though a majority of the community looked like me, I can remember most of the positions of power being filled by white men, ranchers to be exact. As early as elementary to middle school and high school, I cannot recall too many individuals that were of color in teaching positions or administrative positions within the school systems. Nor do I remember learning a whole lot about groups outside of white people, Black people, or all the different wars that we have been a part of. I was born into a Catholic family. And we were in church every weekend. At the age of 3, my parents would divorce, leaving me and my brother to live with my mom. My mom would go on to remarry, and our family would grow. I am the oldest of 7. And it has been quite the journey. My mom bounced around jobs when I was a kid, but somehow we always had what we needed. As kids, we never really understood what being poor was. But when I learned that 30% of Farball's population lives under the poverty threshold, I soon realized that our household income was one of those 30% households. My father was an immigrant. He came over at the age of 13 with a group of friends looking for a better future. His father was Pedro Garcia, and he was a bracero. He would be killed when my dad was 2 months old, leaving my father to be raised by his mother on a ranch in a rural part of Mexico where there was a church, a store, and a school. Needless to say, my dad didn't really get exposed to any type of male figure and always was in survival mode. He would go on to remarry Dora Cortez, and I would meet Aurora Guillen Cortez, aka Nana. Even though Nana was not my biological grandmother, I've had the strongest connection with her of all my grandparents. She recently passed away, and I had the opportunity to go and say my goodbyes before she took her last breath. When I returned for her services and I reflected, I realized that my Nana gave me a sense of belonging. She always advocated for me and my siblings. And because she was quite the storyteller, she always made sure to give us the stories about how our people have always fought to belong and for what's theirs. As I grew, I would find an interest in sports, and I would excel at them. I think because my biological father wasn't around, I created this idea that if I worked hard enough and was better than the other kids, maybe he would want to return and be a part of my life. Even though I had success in sports and had a couple of scholarship offers, as I reflect, sports taught me a lot about myself. They taught me the importance of teamwork, how to communicate, discipline, and most importantly, hard work, which is where I get my grind culture from. I would go on to meet my wife and partner, Heather Montero, in 2009. After dropping out of Reedley College with no guidance or understanding of how to navigate college, I would return to college in 2010 to finish what I started on the football field. Heather was a supporter in all of that, and we would later go on to start our own family. We now have 4 daughters: Sophia, Isabella, Adelina, and Viviana. Throughout my professional journey, I've had many that have supported me, but the one that sticks out is Dr. Brenda Timms. She was a college president at Kalinga College who gave me an opportunity as an academic advisor when I didn't have the experience to meet the minimum quals. She believed in me and she saw potential when I didn't see it or believe in myself. She took me under her wing and once told me, "You will go on to earn your master's so you can get in the classroom and into administration, and then you're going to go back and get your doctorate because you're going to be a college president one day." I looked at her and said, "Not sure how you see all of that, but I have to strongly disagree." If there's one thing that I learned from her, it was how to professionally disagree with people, how to be passionate, but how to channel that emotion so that individuals didn't feel like we were being abrasive. But more than anything, she was so comfortable in her own skin and helped me be comfortable with what I saw in the mirror. In 2021, she accepted a position at Compton College, and I accepted a position in administration as the coordinator of student support services and engagement. I oversee the Basic Needs Center, student government and clubs, and all student engagement opportunities. I help students feel like they belong on our campus. One of the turning points in my career was collaborating with Tim Hernandez, the author of All They Will Call Us. It's a story of 32 immigrants, braceros to be exact, who passed away in a 1948 plane crash and went almost 50 years unidentified. This gave me a sense of embracing my culture and gave me curiosity to start looking into what other stories are out there that we don't get taught about in our curriculum or our K through 12s. My relationship with Tim has grown, and I look forward to the different types of collaborations that we will have. Another turning point in my career was attending my uncle's wedding. Growing up a Catholic and growing up in a rural community, we didn't really see people who were a part of LGBTQ communities. So being able to gather in San Francisco and support them on their journey was a pretty cool experience for me. They even have come on as my keynote speakers for our first ever Pride event, which has started a tradition on our campus. Every year we now celebrate Pride. And if any of you have been to Kalinga, you would understand why that is an accomplishment. I have really grown into my role of helping students become aware and exposed to other cultures, identities, and heritages. And I really enjoy the different collaborations throughout the year in coordinating and organizing events that highlight different heritages and cultures. My why are students and underserved communities on the West Side. I really hope that all of my influences along the way have helped me shape into a leader that will give back to the communities, specifically men of color. There's absolutely a place for us in education, and I want to give them those opportunities and introduce them. Thank you.